like an hour of extra time in the last 2 classes. So, anywho, next week, we'll just really quick go over all the random assignments. You got 3 things that are due. 2 that are sort of more labor intensive, and 1 that's just sort of like a short list of things. So first thing is the robot rig. Bring up. This is like the greatest feature of Word docs. It's amazing. And that's basically just like the instructions are, I feel like, kind of just rig your character. Here's a link to a doc with some rigging videos. It also has a link, and I'll probably post, I'll probably post this directly, but like here's the series of YouTube videos I made specifically for rigging that you can just sort of follow along to, as well as some additional random videos from Moriello, who's sort of like the resident rigging genius here, I guess, on his Vimeo. He also has a bunch of other stuff if you want to ever go through that. He has some really good stuff in there. So that's all linked there. Basic requirements in terms of the actual rig itself. And I go over this, I mentioned like specifically what this is like in the videos whenever you guys watch those, but you will need some kind of IK and FK switch for each of your limbs. I go over 2 versions of that. There's a sort of simple version and what I call the fancy version, which involves like basically for every arm you have 3 versions of the arm joints, and then you gotta like hook them together, and it's very, very robust and good practice for the future, but admittedly kind of overkill for this class. So if you guys want to do like the nicer one, that'll be extra credit if you can get it working on the arms. Apart from that, you should have controllers for all of your joints. So if you have something like a shoulder that looks like it should articulate, and if you have a joint in that shoulder, there must be a controller to go along with that joint. There should be no reason when you are animating or doing anything with your rig where you would have to go in to select a joint and do anything to the joint, or like select an IK handle and play with values in that. You should be doing everything through controllers and little custom attributes that you set up. And again, I'll kind of go over some of that stuff today just as a highlight. And this one like is actually kind of important because rig outliners get really, really gross. But please do organize and name everything in a reasonable fashion. I have my own weird system for rigging, but like y'all are probably gonna have different systems and naming conventions for things, and I just want to be able to go into your rig and tell what's going on, and if I can't and everything's just labeled like joint 74 or like NURBS curve 73, I am not gonna be able to go what's going on, and I will take off points because that's really bad. Especially because other people, like if it's your own personal rig, that's one thing, but like other people are going to be animating this as well, so you should set it up in a way that is understandable to other human beings. Cool. Basically, this is another one where I'm sort of like grading it slightly differently. Basically what I'm going to do is you start out with 10 points by default, and I have a list of just like assorted requirements for the rig, and like if whatever it is broken, I'm going to deduct a certain amount of points for that. And basically, just sort of, like I said, I've tried to be fairly systematic about noting all the things that like I would take points off for, and basically that's also a guide of sort of what I'm looking for and expecting in your rig. And it is possible, if a lot of things are broken or incomplete with your rig, to earn negative points. But I am also allowing 2 weeks for resubmissions on this as opposed to the normal 1 week, because it is very important that you do get a functional rig, and you're welcome to resubmit as many times as you want until either you have something not broken or you're happy with your grade. Also bear in mind that like if your rig is super, super broken by the time you really need to start animating, you are going to have to use Skelebot, and at that point you can also keep resubmitting your rig just sort of throughout the quarter if you have extra time, want to keep working on it as practice, so that hopefully you are able to fix whatever issues you have and like, you know, get a functioning rig by the end of the quarter, because it is a very important thing to understand how to do. Miscellaneous note, if I see other weird stuff that happens to be broken or messed up within the rig, I'll sort of add that to the list as I see things, so it becomes like a standardized thing that I'm looking for. Any questions on any of that so far? All right. So I'm not going to go through and like read everything to you, but again, just a list of like, here's some generic rig stuff. I will be looking at translating, scaling, and rotating your rig because presumably not everyone has made their stuff to scale. And I mean, ideally you would make everything to scale, but stuff happens sometimes. My units are a little weird. And basically, if you need to scale it to put it in your scene to make it the right size, you need to be able to do that. So that's something I'll specifically be looking for. I will also be looking for, like if I notice keyframes on any of your controllers or joints, anything like that, there should be no keyframes set in your rig file at all. Also stuff like rotation values on joints. This is the kind of thing, I'm not going to click through every joint you have because that's frankly would take me probably like 2 days worth of just looking through joints. But if I see issues with your rig and it's caused by rotation values on joints, that is something that I would then take off points for. Also, again, just looking for like different stuff for like IK functionality. I've linked for like the basic IK-FK switch, the YouTube video where I go over how to do that, so hopefully it's obvious what exactly is expected for that particular part of the rig, etc., etc. I've done that like wherever it's relevant. Again, just sort of make sure you have controllers for all of your joints. And then there's also some opportunities at the bottom for bonus points. Again, setting up the sort of nice IK switch, also have a video for that, is going to be 1 point for each limb that you have that set up functionally on. And then there's some other stuff where like if you want to, you know, after your robot's rigged, you can pose it in sort of 3 dynamic poses just as a really quick little test of, hey, here's what my rig can do, and sort of see if it's broken. You have like a little mini animation assignment with it next week. So it's a good way to sort of like proof that and see if you can actually get it into certain positions before you need to animate it. And then for what to submit, the only thing I like super hardcore need is a Maya file with your rig in it. I would recommend, if you can reference your model into your rig if you want, I would recommend just importing it and kind of having done with it. If for some reason you do reference in your model, I will also need the model file and just like a cleaned up version of your project folder so that I can actually open that, set the project, and have your model, you know, show up. Apart from that, if you've done anything, like if you're worried about me finding anything on your rig, if you've added extra attributes that I need to look for, just make a note of where those are so I can be sure that I actually see them or find them. And if you've done anything extra or fancy or special or whatever to your rig, also make a list of that if you want to ensure that you get sort of maximum extra credit points for whatever additional functionality you've added. Ditto with the poses. If you happen to do them, feel free to just throw them up as still images. It's like 3 files. You don't need to zip them. But again, all I really need is the Maya file unless you want to make notes about what else you've submitted. That's pretty much the rig. Are there any questions on that? Okay. So like I said, to do that, I'm not going to go over how to do like an entire rig in class. For one, it would take forever, and like I said, I do have the video tutorials up, so you should be able to just sort of follow along with that. They're broken down into like 10, 20-minute chunks of sort of like individual tasks to do. If you have issues doing anything throughout the week, please feel free to let me know. I am pretty much always available by email. But yeah, so that's the rig. Other thing that's due is your reference cut together. So basically this is going to be you and your teammate either filming each other or finding somebody else to be your film subjects. And you're going to shoot reference that you're going to use to actually animate your final and cut it together as if it's your final clip. So this is basically going to be sort of working on your timing, getting another proof of your camera angles, and again, shooting functional reference so you can actually animate off of it. Whether you want to do, and I'll go over this sort of more shortly, but whether you want to do orthographic reference, so like 2 cameras, one from the front and one from the side, for some or all of your animation, or if you just want to sort of shoot a single camera angle more or less from the view that your camera would actually be in the final render. You can choose kind of whatever makes sense for you guys or the particular clip that you're working on. All I really require is, again, the reference should be cut together as if it was your final project. So if you guys, you know, you say like action and then the actor sort of idles for 2 seconds before doing anything, like that 2 seconds should be cut out. If you're watching this, it should feel like, you know, a final cohesive story with good timing, decent camera angles, all of that stuff. Basically treat it as like the final cut of your animation, but instead of using your rendered robots, you're going to be using human test subjects. Other thing, cameras should not be handheld, especially for orthographic shots. Find a cheap tripod or like a stack of textbooks and a water bottle to prop your camera up on. Just please don't do handheld cameras. And then just like a weird little thing, if you could just tag each piece of reference, presumably it's going to be, you know, different cuts, like whenever you have a camera cut or something. If you could just tag who's doing what, or like who's animating which piece of that animation, just somewhere in the corner, like up out of the way, so that I can get a better idea of how you guys plan on breaking up the animation. If I notice anything really weird, like one person is just, again, animating like all the running sequences and the other two are just sort of like animating people standing in one spot, that's something I might comment on and be like, hey, you guys should like maybe shift some of this stuff around a little bit before you actually start animating. So that's the general requirements for this. I have some other specific things for like if you are using orthographic reference, as well as if you're just using a single camera and sort of shooting from camera angle. If you do orthographic stuff, I would recommend doing that if you have like a really complex walk cycle, like someone limping or something really crazy. But I will be kind of a stickler for, you should have two camera angles, at least two camera angles, and the reference must sync up with each other. So I'll show you an example of that. But basically what I don't want to see is, we're just going to not comment on any of this. The animation is terrible. Everything about this is terrible. It's a good example of orthographic reference. But you'll notice that like my feet, if you look at like the heels or whatever, they touch the ground at the same frame in both of the reference. And I mean, with the exception of like when I pretty much walk off camera at the end, my whole body is in frame pretty much the whole time, again, except at the very end. But I have that extra little foot thing to compensate for. All right, I'm never showing that again, thank God. But that's pretty much what I'm looking for orthographic reference. So what I don't want to see is like, take cell phone, put it in front of you, do your actions, stop recording, move cell phone to side, do your actions, and then try to sync those together. Because if you're doing the same thing, even if you try to be as close as possible, it's never going to sync up, and that's going to make your life way harder for animating. It's like one of my weird, really stickler things, if you do orthographic reference. All right, I think that's pretty much it. Cell phone footage is totally fine as long as the quality is okay. So just, you know, I recommend filming in like a well-lit area wherever applicable. I also have some other suggestions of, like, if you wear really, really dark clothing or white clothing, it might be harder to see what's going on, just because it's harder to expose, like, black than it is, you know, light blue or gray or whatever. And I would also recommend, if it happens to be convenient, to wear tighter clothing, or at least don't do, like, a super baggy sweatshirt. Because if you do that, I mean, like, I can shift my arm around in a sweatshirt and you can't see what my arm is, you can't even tell that it's moving. So by wearing, like, something at least not super crazy baggy, it will allow you to actually see what is going on and make your reference more functional. Other thing is if all you got is, like, black shirts, you can always put pieces of colored tape on yourself. You'll look like a crazy person, but your reference will be significantly easier to tell what's going on, because those little tape dots will sort of move around and you'll be able to actually see those. But yeah. So I have another sort of old, why do I forget how to open Google Doc links? So here's another thing that I did where I was wearing a pretty dark shirt and I couldn't really see what my hips are doing. So this is like an example of, I put tape on myself and you can see it makes it a little bit easier to see sort of how my hips are like rotating back and forth. So this would just be sort of an example of using one camera shot. It's pretty much the same as like what I'm doing for my render to do that. That's pretty much the sort of technical requirements for cutting the reference together. In terms of the grading scheme, it's basically going to be 4 points for, like, can you tell what's happening? If you're using orthographic clips, do they sync together? is it reasonable quality if you're trying to like, have you cut the entire character's head off if that should be in frame? Weird stuff like that. And then 3 points for the quality of how things are cut together. So that's going to be the timing, a tiny bit of camera angle stuff. I'm not going to be like as nitpicky on that. I'd rather you have good reference and like match camera angles perfectly. And also have you divided up the animation burden reasonably evenly between all of the members of your team. Only thing that's due is a compressed video of your reference. And again, for some reason, I think there may or may not have been confusion about this last quarter, but disclaimer, when I say compressed video, I do mean compress it with Media Encoder or some other program. Putting it in a zip file is not compressing your files. So when I say compressed, Media Encoder is your friend. Any questions on what's actually due for the reference? Okay. So this is a group assignment. And I do have some reference here of like actual professional people that have done this. So I'm just going to sort of go ahead and show you one of those really quick. I'm not going to lie, they're really funny to watch. You should totally check them out. Like, I'll only show you this one, but they're pretty amusing.
I'm on a mission from above.
This is the best audio
Are you
I have.
the baby
Sorry.
Jesus?
Yes, I'm the baby Jesus. No! You see, I'm more middle management for the company.
The company? What company?
Here. Take this. It'll explain everything.
What do you want me to do with that?
I want you to suck it.
You suck it.
No, it's for you to suck.
Ugh, I'm not sucking that.
Suck it.
I don't know where it's been. They're gone.
I failed.
I would have gotten to my parents if I didn't have to go back for you.
What? We would have been here in plenty of time if you knew how to ride a bike like a normal kid. We're never gonna stop the launch on time.
Who cares? My parents are in danger.
I care. Baby Corps is going to go out of business.
Ugh, that's all you ever talk about. You don't even know what it's like to be part of a family.
And you don't know what it's like to have a job.
You don't know anything about hugs or bedtime stories or special songs.
Oh, please. Stop acting like a baby.
You're a baby.
You take that back.
My life was perfect until you showed up.
Oh, believe me, kid, the feeling is mutual. I wish I'd never met you.
I wish you'd never been born. Where are you going? Fine.
Yes. I did say they were vaguely amusing. But yeah, so I mean, that would be an example of sort of cut reference. Like if you were watching that even without the overlay of the final animation, you'd still be able to tell what was going on, even if it is a little bit disconcerting to like watch grown men pretend to be babies. The other thing to note about that is they did a really good job matching the camera angles, which again isn't something I'm going to be like super weird about. But in the shots where they had both of them together, you notice that their eye line, like when they were shooting that reference, they were paying attention to the scale of the characters in relation to each other. So they always had the older kid sort of looking down and the baby looking up. And they actually physically scaled the camera down for the baby so that he was actually smaller in the frame. So that's something that would be good to sort of keep in mind if you're doing robots that are like dramatically different sizes. But yeah, so again, there's more examples of that. They're all kind of just like similar things. I think the one from Epic was pretty funny, but yeah. Any questions on other questions on reference? Cool. So the only other thing that's due, and this should be a fairly quick assignment, is basically just a list of who is doing what in your group. And this is fluid. It's not by any means like officially committing anyone to doing anything. It's just sort of you guys planning, getting together, and figuring out, you know, a rough timeline and like who you think should do stuff. If you need to change it along the way, totally cool. But basically the requirements for this is a little shot list and who will animate each scene. If you want to, you're also welcome if you want for that to just sort of like throw in the cut reference with your names in it again. If you don't want to make like a typed out list and just sort of use that. Or you can type out a list, whatever makes things easier for you guys. The other thing you should be looking at is environmental assets, so who's making them, who's texturing them, all of that good stuff. If you have any like simulations or whatever happening, who's dealing with that. And also keep in mind that whoever models an asset doesn't need to be the one to texture it. So if one person is like obsessed with modeling, they can model all of the environments in the scene and the other person can texture all of them. It's whatever you guys feel like is reasonable or fair in your group, like however you guys want to work is totally fine. Again, this is mostly like a planning thing. And then also for stuff like special effects and sound, like if you're doing anything, what is it? Who does it? Do you have if it's necessary to your story, you should have some kind of backup in case you are unable for some reason to complete said special effects or sound effect. And then just do some it can be really, really vague, but like a timeline of when you get things done. So this could be as simple as by week 8, we want to have, half the environmental stuff done, and by week 9, we want it textured. It could be as specific as like week 7, these particular models are due. Week 8, these are going to be textured, this is going to be modeled. So again, however detailed you want for that, it should just be something, so this is to make sure that you're all on the same page on who's doing what, when things need to get done. So hopefully there's no issues of, oh, I thought you needed that in 2 weeks, and you're like, no, I needed that like 3 hours ago, and then there's like, oh. But yeah, so I do recommend for this, if there's a way, perhaps like a Google Doc or something similar, where you can sort of like type things and update it on the fly and everyone's automatically updated. Might make everything convenient. Color coding is perhaps a thing that you might like, but whatever works for you guys is totally fine with me. Other thing, just like, disclaimer, when I'm grading this, I'm not grading this based on who says they'll do the most stuff or anything like that. It's literally, I just want you guys to have some kind of cohesive plan as a team. Again, formatting is largely up to you. And the sort of secondary purpose of this is if for some reason there's any disputes of someone not doing what they said, or like some kind of weird dispute within your team that needs to come to me to get resolved for some reason, this is what I'll be referencing. Like if someone's like, oh, person whoever like didn't do anything that they were supposed to do, I will literally look at this list and be like, what were they supposed to do? What have they done? And sort of like use this as a way to gauge that. But I don't really foresee that super happening, but like, again, secondary purpose of this. This is one of those weird assignments where you should just sort of do it. I might make this like -1 or something to 0, but basically you gotta do it, and if you don't do it, it's worth like 1 or 2 negative points. It's just sort of one of those. And what to submit is a link to a Google Drive doc if you've worked in Google Drive, or just sort of, PDF. Submit me whatever makes sense for however you've created this thing. But that's pretty much the list of who does what. Are there any questions on that? Okay. So like I said, 3 assignments. Rig is due next week. Also the reference in this little doc. And in case you guys are wondering, after the rig is due, next week there's a little mini assignment for like animating, where you just do like a quick little walk cycle with your rig. And that's designed, for one, you can test animating a human character if you've never done that. And also, make sure your rig isn't exploding before you commit it to your final project. And also next week, I'll do a little thing about like how to animate a walk cycle, some tips and tricks and things to sort of keep in mind when animating a human character. And then it will mostly be open lab, because I assume that people will have issues with their rig and other things that they need to straighten out, and I want to make sure that there is time to do that. So please do bring your rig or whatever other things you need to work on, because it will be a lot of open lab next week. That's pretty much all the assignment stuff. Any questions on that? Cool. All right, let me close some nonsense. Are there any questions on anything? So like I said, I'm gonna run through a few of the things that I sort of touched on in the rigging videos. I'll show you a little bit of soft binding, because that's not something I went over. I'll probably do a video on that. And then I'll show you a really janky way to sort of rig cables. It actually, I say janky, it works pretty well. It's just like kind of convoluted to set up. Before we get into that, is there anyone have any questions about anything? Cool. All right. So first thing I want to touch on is First of all, actually, so I know I said like watch all the videos before you come to class. I assume that most people didn't get through all of them. Did anybody on the off chance actually get through all of them? Cool. For those of you that hopefully you started watching some of them, I am going to proceed as if you sort of understand the basics of like joints and controllers and like what that is. Feel free to stop me if you have questions, but for those of you that were watching, do you guys remember maybe about how far you got through those videos? Fair enough. Well, they're there, and you should watch them to figure out how to rig things at some point. But basically, I just sort of want to illustrate the difference again between an IK and FK setup, because I was happened to be watching some videos on it for Grins, and a guy said something that like kind of for some reason made something about rigging like click in my head and like why I was using these things in the way that I was, and I was like, it was like such a dumb thing, and I was like, oh, this is actually very, very helpful to me, so maybe it would be helpful to you guys. So again, the difference between an IK and FK setup is basically, it actually, what sort of clicked with me is actually realizing what they stood for. So FK stands for forward kinematics, and IK stands for inverse kinematics. So this is an FK setup where if you sort of imagine that this is like a wonky little arm and there's sort of like a torso here. So this is the shoulder and this is like the hand basically. FK, you animate basically from the core outward. So if you take the shoulder, it's going to affect everything that comes after it. So like this little elbow, this fake little hand. If I grab the elbow, it's going to mess with the hand, but not the shoulder. So I actually, again, really like this for animating swinging arms in a walk cycle. You get really nice arcs for it. It's not always applicable, in which case you might, instead of moving the shoulder and having that affect the hand, you might want to move the hand and have it affect the elbow and the shoulder. And that's where IK comes in. IK is like inverse kinematics, basically do the opposite of what FK does. So that would be pretty much grabbing like the hand, and again, this is going to move everything else behind the hand, or like closer to the core. So FK is sort of like animate from the inside outwards, and IK is animate from the outward in, if that makes any sense. I don't know, something about hearing it explained like that was just like, oh, that makes so much sense. The other way to think about it, which is accurate, but like kind of a shallow description, is sort of, I guess, how I've described it before, where like FK, if you want to like bend the arm, you would have to move the shoulder, move the elbow, and then like move the wrist. So it's you manually animating all of the joints, and IK is sort of like grab the hand and it will animate everything else for you. So in a shallow sense, IK can, you know, be used to control multiple joints at once, versus FK is like individual control of the joints. There's other sort of, you know, ways around that if you get into like more fancy rigging, but as like a basic understanding, that can also be how you look at it. So again, FK is like forward kinematics, kind of works from the core outwards. IK, inverse kinematics, does the opposite, goes from the outside in. I just thought it was kind of a different, interesting way to look at it. So I do have, well, I have the random joint chains up. Anyone have a different question between the difference between IK and FK? Cool. I just want to touch on two other things for IK handles, and that is pretty much the way that you control how they bend. So you will notice that I sort of pre-baked a bend into this joint chain, and if I bend this handle, it's going to move. You can see that like everything's just sort of on the origin. It's going to move in the direction that I've put that little bend in the skeleton. If on the off chance you try, let me make a skeleton. This is going to be highly, highly, highly gross. So this is what happens if you snap into place. Take a completely straight joint chain like this. Thank you. And put an IK handle on it. Usually good things do not happen, so you'll notice like if I move this, the elbow actually doesn't move at all. I feel like interesting. Normally it just sort of bends and flips out. I'm actually not sure, but this is clearly not how you want the arm to work. Interesting. It's never broken in that particular way, but again, sort of like a weird janky demo of like, if you have the bend, the handles just sort of work nicely and bend in the direction you expect. And I know I didn't say this, I think I maybe should have spelled this out more explicitly, but when I said put a bend in your arms and your legs, that would be, imagine that you are standing in T-pose yourself and you bend just your elbows forward. They would be bending towards the front of your body. So you would only really notice that bend if you're looking like top down. That's what I was intending you guys to do for the bend in your arms. If you set it up differently, I would recommend switching it to that if it's still easy. But I'm not going to take points off that for that because I realized that like a few people asked me about that and it seems like there was sort of some confusion with the way that I explained that. But basically the reason I say to sort of set it up like that is if you bend your arm by default, it's going to bend like a normal arm. If you put the bend sort of facing down, so if you're looking at your character from the front, it's like a V in the arm. When you bend the IK handle, the arm is going to bend like straight down, and it works fine. It's just a little bit awkward to animate. So that was sort of like basically the thinking behind putting the bend in the joint chains. Same thing for the knee. You would want that facing forward, so if you move your character down, the knees come forward, unless you for some reason have a design where they are designed to bend backwards. Any questions on any of that? Cool. Excuse me. All right, so again, two things I really want to touch on really, really quickly. There is sort of two ways to control which way the elbow bends. So right now, you'll notice that if I grab the IK handle and move this around, if I'm just translating this around, I don't really have a lot of control over where the elbow's going. You'll notice once I start doing this, it kind of starts like wigging out and like moving in some weird directions. So it is important to put on controls for this, and there's two ways to do that. The first is using a pole vector constraint. And basically what that does, I kind of think of it as like more or less an aim constraint where the elbow is going to point, like if this is your controller, probably good to use a NURBS curve, but I'm using a sphere because I'm lazy. But basically your elbow is going to try to point at this pretty much all the time. So one thing you'll also notice that sort of helps to visualize how these pole vectors work is this little sort of triangle here. This is going to be at the top of whatever IK you create, so usually for a humanoid it's going to be either like at the hips or the shoulders is where you're going to find this little triangle. Basically what this does is it shows you the rotation plane of the arm. And you can sort of visualize the rotation plane, so you'll notice like if I move this straight back and forth, again it sort of follows, it makes like a nice little triangle here, and it kind of follows whatever direction this little white line is pointing. So if you ever need to, again, visualize that, you can go in and just like create a really goofy little polygon. I'm just sort of vert snapping this to the points in this arm. So you have this, and again, you'll notice that like if I bend this, the elbow and the joints are pretty much staying parallel with this little rotation plane here. This triangle is pointing sort of, again, parallel or like going on the same, like on this same little plane. So whenever you're moving your handle around, this is sort of always, again, like just sort of indicating, how that plane is facing and explaining sort of how your elbow is pointing in space. So you can control that, again, fairly simply just by setting up a little controller. In this case, I just made this goofy little sphere, and I'm just going to grab the sphere and grab the IK handle and just come up to constrain and do pole vector. This is one of the glorious things that has pretty much no settings associated with it, except is it turned on or is it turned off? So you can pretty much just go ahead and hit apply. And you'll notice that when it does that, it makes this little, it draws this sort of little line from the triangle to your control. You'll also notice, if you were looking at it before, so there's like a little green triangle before I set this up that was sort of set up in your IK handle, kind of outlining, highlighting the rotation plane. That's no longer there, and that's actually been attached now to your little controller. So basically it's saying instead of the rotation plane being set up between the middle joint, or in this case the elbow, it's going to use this to sort of determine how your elbow is bending. So your elbow is always going to stay on this rotation plane between your controller, and the first and last joint in your IK handle. So if we go ahead and we move this thing around, you can see that it is basically controlling the direction that the elbow is pointing at. It does, if you move it like hardcore back and forth, it doesn't necessarily have a lot of changes. It's mostly like moving it sort of, you know, up and down that's going to produce the most dramatic change. And that also holds true if I were to run around and sort of, you know, bend the arm around. It does a little bit of a weird job, like if your controller is like way off to the side, but it is trying to keep the joints, you'll notice, parallel with this sort of triangle or this plane between the first point, the controller, and the last point in this IK handle. So it can be a fairly good way if you just sort of want to set up like a relatively easy control for your character. I honestly don't use these super frequently, purely because I am terrible about losing these controllers in my scene, which is really stupid. But for some reason, I can never keep them in the right spot. Like they will work if they're like 1,000 units away from your character, but that also means they're 1,000 units away from your character, and if you're not paying attention to where they are, they can be kind of easy to lose. Which is honestly a petty reason to not use them, because they do work very nicely. I'm just crazy and can't keep track of them. So usually what I will end up doing is making a custom attribute on this controller, or like a controller, and modifying the twist of the IK handle. So you'll notice if I click on the IK handle itself, you can go into your channel box and there's this attribute for twist. And if you play with that, it's also going to control basically the rotation of the pull vector. So you can see that it's just basically a second way to kind of do the same thing. You're just manually controlling the rotation or the value of this instead of using a controller to do it. But like I said before, if you are doing a rig, you pretty much never want to have to go in and like set keyframes on your IK handle. For one, it's a pain to find, and two, you might accidentally keyframe something you don't want, and that's bad. So usually what you will do for that, why is this so huge? Usually what you'll do for that is create a sort of custom attribute. So I'll go over that really quick. I go over it in the videos like I think at least 3 times, but it is a good thing to know how to do. I'll go over it a little bit more in depth now. So I'm just going to assume that I'm going to use the same little sphere to add a twist control for. So does anybody happen to know how to add a custom attribute for this with like custom name? You can set up whatever value you want for it. Cool. It's actually really, really straightforward. Mercifully, it's like one of the easier things to do in Maya, I think. Grab whatever thing you want to add an attribute to, go into your channel box, go to the edit menu, and just do edit add attribute. It's going to pull up this delightful little box where you can name your controller whatever you want. In this case, I'm going to say cheese puffs because I'm apparently hungry. So again, name is purely for you. I recommend making it something descriptive and better than cheese puffs, but eh. So the only other 2 things that I usually pay attention to in this, I kind of just leave everything keyable, and honestly, I'm not entirely sure what this does, is the data type and the minimum maximum values and kind of default. So there's 3 main data types that I use. Usually I will use float and integer for pretty much everything. Every once in a while I'll use a boolean and an enum. But these are, so for those of you that are familiar with coding, if this looks like the same sort of like something you would set up as a variable or something like that, for coding, it's exactly the same thing. So does anybody happen to know the difference between a float and an integer?
Yeah, a float has a decimal.
Yeah.
Integers don't.
Right. Yeah, so float values can be set to something with a decimal in it if you want, like 2.3. Integers can't. They can only be 0, 1, 2, 3, 42, whatever. So this, if you think you need something where you might want to input a decimal value, use a float. And if you don't care about that and you only want like whole numbers, use an integer. Anyone know what a boolean is?
True or false.
Yeah. True, false, yes, no, 1, 0. And enums, basically, honestly, I don't know if I've ever found a use for these, but basically this is going to be if you need to select from a predefined set of options like green, blue, good for colors, good for other things. You can also use this as like an on and off switch. So you can modify these if you don't want green or blue. You can say orange and just like pretty much type in a new name for it, hit enter, and it'll swap that. If you want to add a new value, so you have more than 2 things, just click on beneath it and say value, hit enter. It'll just add those values in. So really quick, I will just go through and sort of show you what all of these look like. I'll start with the enum since I actually have it set up. And basically just set all this to whatever you want, hit add, and you'll notice that it just pops that new attribute right into the side over here, and you are then free to animate this or do whatever you want to it. Usually I'll have to hook up some other values to it. But I'm going to go ahead and, again, sort of set up some values. So for the float, I'm not going to do anything with the minimum and maximum. I'm just going to kind of leave that as it is. Go ahead and add that. Int. Huzzah. For the integer, I will add, this is usually how I use integers, is to make my own booleans manually. So I'm just going to enter a value, minimum value of 0 and a maximum of 1. So theoretically, the only numbers I should be able to choose are 0 and 1. It's not going to accept any negative values or any numbers larger than 1. I'm going to go ahead and add that in and just make a boolean. There are no options for booleans because they're very, very simple switches. I'm just going to go ahead and add that in. So you can see we have all of these lovely attributes over here, and they all behave a little bit differently. So the enum, you can pretty much just click on it, and again, based on the options that you input previously, it's going to give you this little drop down where you can just sort of select whatever values you want for that. Float, you have the option to, I've set no minimum or maximum on this float, so I can pretty much scrub through this and enter whatever weird number I want. Note that, again, there are decimals here. For the integer, this one I did, again, minimum of 0, maximum of 1, so I can scrub through these and pretty much choose values of only 1 or only 0. And this is my personal preference if I need to set up a switch of some kind, like a yes-no. I think booleans are just awkward to work with. It will do exactly the same thing, but to modify a boolean, you'll notice it says off, it's a little bit more descriptive, but to change it, you literally need to click it and type in on. And I'm too lazy to do that, so I don't use them. And same thing for off. Like, you have to literally click on it and type in off, which is just like, I don't know, it's an extra like 4 or 5 key presses for every time I have to change that, and for me, that's too many. You can also, again, if you wanted to, swap an enum out instead of like green and orange, say on and off, and just make a little switch where like I think it's easier to even just click on this and manually just click on a value rather than typing it in. But again, the same kind of setup for enums, int, and bools. You can do all the same things with them. Any questions on any of that so far? Cool. So if you ever need to edit these, in this case, I have a deep and burning hatred of booleans. I would like to just delete this entirely. You can just click on the attribute you want to obliterate, go to edit, and just delete attributes. It'll get rid of that. That will never come back unless you happen to Control-Z it fast enough. So if you wanted to reset that up, you would have to like manually redo that. You can also modify these, like if I need to add a new value to my enum, maybe I decided, oops, I need to enter negative values for my boolean. Just go into edit and edit attributes. And it pulls up all of the, it's not going to pull up any of the default like translate, rotate, scale. You can't really do anything with those. Those are just sort of like there, baked into Maya. But any values that you've added, it'll pull them up so that you can mess with them. So in this case, like I can go in, you'll notice I can't change the data type, so I can't change like an int to a float. But I can, you know, turn off has minimum and go ahead, and I should now be able to enter negative values into this integer, whereas previously I couldn't. So you can modify the minimum and maximum values if you wanted to, and I was like, maybe naming this cheese puff enum was a bad plan. I could name this bad plan, whatever, and go ahead and just hit enter, and it'll, you know, rename things. So that's pretty much how you add, edit, and edit attributes, and sort of what they do. Does anybody have any questions on any of that? Yeah.
Do these new attributes get affected with like delete history and freeze transforms?
No. So delete history, definitely not. I will go ahead and just for grins freeze the transformations on this, and that apparently does not do anything to your values, which kind of makes sense because the transformations are really only translate, rotate, scale. But yeah, that's a good point, which I, for some reason, never thought about before. But yeah, so these are sort of their own like weird little standalone things. Any other questions? Cool. All right. So we have these values at this point. I'm just going to delete this thing because it's random. But what do we actually do with them? Because it's not super helpful to just have a bunch of random numerical values that don't do anything. So in this case, I'm going to hook up the twist attribute of this IK into that custom attribute that I just made. So what you want to do is go into your Windows, General Editors, Connection Editor. I don't know why it always opens on the other screen. And basically, by default, it's set up so that the driver or the thing with the attribute you want to change something else is going to be set up on the left, and whatever you want to be controlled is set up on the right. You can swap that back and forth if you do, just click on this little like From To button. I'm going to leave it at default for now. But you'll notice if you have the sphere selected, it loads automatically as a driver object with all of the sort of random values in it selected. If you want to add in the IK handle, just click it and do reload right, and it'll pop that right in over here. To actually hook up the values, I'm just going to select the attribute that I want. In this case, I'm going to use float. Probably would make more sense to name it something like twist, but I have that set up here, so I'm just going to use float. And then basically, once you have selected a value you want to control something else, you're able to come in here to the driven object and click on pretty much any value that's not grayed out. So in this case, it shows you the twist value right here. And you'll notice that as soon as I click on that, it adds this little sort of yellow bar indicating that this value is connected to something else, it's being controlled by something else, and you can't edit it manually. So to access this, I would actually have to go in and like change the twist value or the float value on this controller I added. So you'll notice like if I do that, it's now actually controlling the twist of the IK arm. And actually when I set this up originally, it was set to a value of like -200 something. So when I hooked it up originally, it actually snapped the arm into that position. But basically all this is doing with the connection editor is a direct translation of whatever value you put into this float attribute on the control is translated into the twist value of the IK handle. So it's a really convenient way to, usually I use this for twists. A lot of times I'll use it to sort of control finger rotation without needing to click on a bajillion finger joints, or a bajillion finger controls, I should say. But it's pretty handy to be able to do this. And again, I do this several times in the video for an assortment of different things, but it is quite handy to know how to do. That's pretty much all I had for IK handles. So are there any questions on that? Cool. All right, next thing I wanted to go over is smooth skin binding or soft binding, which should be, you should have at least one part of your model that is soft bound. So with this, I will also give you a very, very, very bad demonstration of how to model a human relatively low poly finger, because it takes 2 seconds and is kind of more fun to animate than a cylinder. That being said, I will disclaimer this and say the last 2 times I did this demo, Maya crashed on me at least 3 times while doing this, and it's the simplest thing ever. So we'll see if you guys are luckier than my other classes and that doesn't happen. Anywho, when making a finger, I usually start with a cylinder. I'm also just going to go ahead and set the subdiv on the axis to like 8. 6 is usually the lowest you want to go for a finger. Anything below that kind of gets cubey and weird looking. 8 is a little bit better resolution, but not like absurdly high. So I'll just rotate that to the side, and basically whenever I make a finger, I just sort of grab these faces, extrude them out, and if you guys remember I'll do two sort of demos for this. All right. But if you guys remember from CGI 1 and 2, whenever you are doing something where you want to define a hard bend, you need to put in at least 3 edge loops to define how that bends. So even if you're doing low poly assets, you will be bending this object. So in this case, like here's my really awkward just like sausage finger setup. So you can kind of see I've left areas where there's like 3 edge loops, more or less where you might expect like a hard joint to be in a finger. So again, even if you're doing low poly modeling, you still do need 3 loops to define a nice crease in a finger. Yeah. So the other thing that I usually do, just again, purely to make this finger look a little bit nicer, and this is personal preference, I'm just going to grab the lower vertices on this finger and just sort of like pop them up a little bit, and maybe give this some like halfway kind of sadly defined knuckles. Just kind of like scale these apart a little bit, again, purely for aesthetics. So we have now a sad, lumpy finger. I did promise you it would be bad looking. If you guys want to add a fingernail to this, my sort of silly default way that I've been using since I was in school that seems to work really, really well, sort of define it with edge loops wherever you want it on the top, just extrude, and push the nail straight down and straight in so it's like under the skin a little bit, and extrude it again, and push it straight up and straight out. And this will give you a kind of like crappy, dodgy looking little fingernail that if you want, you can sort of give a horrifying manicure to and just like make it really long. This is even worse than the one that I did yesterday, which was like a 2-inch long nail. But yeah, I don't know. Crappy finger demo. It'll serve our purposes for rigging. I'm gonna save this actually really quick in case this explodes, which I can see being a thing. Type better. Finger. I swear to God, if Maya crashes on me trying to save the file, I will be salty, because it looks like that's what's happening. Alright.
Just like let it go.
Yeah.
Just let it crash.
Let it go. Yeah, I literally, it's doing the thing where I can't click on anything. That's fun. I'm gonna, yay! So remember when I said you should save your files, guys? Ignore that, because apparently it's a lie. Don't ignore that, you should always save your files. But like, why? Okay. It's gonna be great. I'm gonna make another crappy finger. It's gonna be delightful. When I was like, I'm gonna be responsible and save my files, it's like, no, you're not. I don't know why this is the one demo that keeps causing issues in Maya. It's incredibly annoying. Alright. Why is this set up differently? Okay. I'm gonna speed model a finger, guys. It's gonna be terrible. Finger. Haha. Haha. Shoot, and I left all the edge loops in. Whatever. Alright, so I'm just gonna rotate this to the side and still sort of do that thing where I just grab these and bring them up, because, I don't know, it makes me... Yes. Oh, yes, in case you didn't guys know, there's like... That's not how grammar works. There's a weird thing you can do when you are rotating, which is using J. So if you like go into your rotate tool, and this also works, I think, for scaling and also moving, but if you press and hold down J, it'll snap to 15-degree increments when you rotate, which is just really nice if you don't want to like manually. You can see it sort of like 75, 90. It's just very, very convenient. It's a delightful hotkey if you weren't aware that exists.
Why did they make J the default?
I don't know why J is the default. I know you can also actually set the value of J if you prefer like 25-degree increments or something like that. Yeah.
Can you import customized hotkeys?
You should be able to. I know you can at least reset up hotkeys, but there are, and I don't remember how to do it because I never do it. Yeah, but there's a way, if you guys ever like have preferences you like in Maya, you can save your preferences and just like throw that file in, and it'll like import all of your nice stuff for use on lab computers or wherever. But yeah. Alright. I don't know why making fingernails is like super fun to me, but it is, so... buttons. Hiya. Alright. So we have... Oh god. Alright, so we have a crappy finger set up again. Still makes me sad, but whatever. I may have put the fingernail on the side of whatever. We're gonna ignore that for now. All right, so God. So what you want to do when you're setting up joints for this is pretty much set up stuff like the same way you would for an actual finger. So I'm just gonna, in this case, I'm gonna pretend like if this was attached to a hand, there'd be a little joint back here. So I'm just gonna kind of like put that in, and then I'm gonna make a joint at the base of the finger. And I usually, again, personal preference, I could just put a joint chain straight across through the middle of the finger. I kind of like bending it up a little bit just so the joint is slightly closer to the top of the finger. Totally personal preference. You guys can sort of do whatever gives you the bend that you want. It's very disconcerting with the nail being here. So really quick, I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate this because I'm going to do sort of 2 different demos on how to tweak this. But a quick thing about the viewport. If you ever want to see your joints through your model, you can go to Shading and X-Ray Joints, and it will show your skeleton through your models from any angle without you needing to like go into wireframe mode because it's terrible to look at. All right, so basics of smooth binding. Grab your skin, grab your skeleton, and go up to Skin, Bind Skin. In this case, there's a few options. There's, again, I kind of go over this in the video, but there's 3 I usually pay attention to. The Bind To, Maximum Influences, and Maintain Maximum Influences. So starting with just Bind To, if it's set to Joint Hierarchy, it's going to attach the skin to whatever joints you've selected, as well as any joints physically attached to them. So in this case, I've only clicked on this joint. Selecting Joint Hierarchy is going to also bind the skin to these 2 joints here, as well as this weird one that I've sort of put in space for the hand. If you do selected joints, that's only going to attach it to the joints you have selected. Depending on what you need, you can, like a lot of times for attaching stuff like eyeballs, where I only want them to be controlled by a single eye joint, or in this case, like the pieces of the robot that I made and hooked up to the rig, I set this to selected joints. It just sort of went through and systematically connected, you know, one hard piece of model to one joint. In the case, because this is like a squishy model that I want multiple controls, I am going to set this to Joint Hierarchy. The other thing that I usually check, and again, this is like personal preference, I usually set max influences to 3. I think by default it's set to 5. But basically what this is each joint, whenever we bind this, is going to, or each vertex in a model is going to be controlled by a certain number of joints. So if that's set to 5, when you bind it, when you bind a skin by default, each vertex is going to have 5 joints that affect it. Personally, I just think this is a lot of joints, usually unnecessary and kind of unmanageable. So I set it to 3 because that is just kind of easier to work with for me. But again, set this to whatever makes you guys happy. And the only other thing that I usually pay attention to is maintain max influences, which I usually turn off. I go out of my way to turn that off. Basically what this is as you're modifying the influence of all the joints on a particular vertex, if it ever for some reason ends up being, if you set your max influences to 5 and you're trying to set it up so that only 3 joints affect your vertex, a lot of times it'll sort of forcibly add weights back in to try to be like, no, you set this to 5, you're gonna keep 5 joints affecting this vert. So I usually just turn this off. I find it causes more problems for me personally than it ever solves or fixes. So I just kind of ignore that setting. So I'm just gonna go ahead and hit apply. And you can see now that if we, I am going to really quickly just sort of put some crappy keyframes on these. Again, do not keyframe your joints if you are actually animating them. I'm just doing this for demo purposes because I don't want to have to select my joints every time. But you can see that as we move these, we now get, I'm not going to call this good deformation because it looks like the finger has been shrunken and shriveling in the sun for like 3 weeks. It is, yeah, it's not pretty. But it does bend like a finger does, which is exciting. Just for grins, I will show you guys what happens if you use selected joints instead of joint hierarchy. So basically when I bend this, this is only going to follow the second joint, which again, makes no sense for a finger, but it is really good for hard pieces of a model, like robot pieces that are metal and are not bending. So it totally has its place, just not in this particular finger instance. If you ever decide like, I need to detach the skin, that was definitely not what I wanted, just click on your skin and go to Skin, Unbind Skin, and it should detach that. One thing I do want to point out actually about, why is this so big? About unbinding the skin is, so I just Control-Z'd until it was still bound. You'll notice that when this is bound, it grays out all of the values for translate, rotate, and scale. Basically what this is saying, hey, this is being controlled by something else, you now can't modify these values. It's locked the values basically, so you can't mess with them. Because again, at this point the joints should be controlling the skin, not you. Every once in a while, whenever I unbind a skin, it doesn't unlock those values manually. So if you ever unbind a skin and then you're like, why can't I move this or select it or like do anything useful to it? Double check the channel box. If it still has that little gray-blue line here, you just have to unlock the attributes manually. So select them all and just right-click and do Unlock Selected. That should fix your issue if for some reason they're locked. You can also do the same thing, like if you decide, oops, I only want to rotate this, I don't want to translate it. You can manually lock joints yourself if you want, so then you literally would not be able to translate that anywhere. Weird tidbits. Any questions on that? Cool. Excuse me. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and, for the sake of sketchy demo purposes, so we have right now pretty much the same bend and bind on each of these fingers. What I'm going to do is just hide the joints, and I will show you two different ways to modify the basically bend and how the joints affect each skin. So the first one that most people usually use is if you just click on your model, right-click, and do Paint Skin Weights tool. It's going to pull up this delightful menu. It's basically what this is. It shows you all of the joints that have influence on a particular skin. And if you click through it, you can actually see a visual representation on your model of where those joints are having the most influence. So as you click through, you can see this is like the last joint in the chain, has the most influence on the tip of the finger compared to, over here, like the end, that kind of thing. One thing that I usually turn on by default is the color ramp. I used to hate it and now I love it, but it, for me, gives you a little bit more information on what's actually happening with those influences. So you can see down here, sort of blue is the least influence, red is like a lot of influence, white is total influence from a single joint, and black is no influence from a joint at all. So you'll notice, like, right here, this is all blue, so joint 2 is apparently having a little bit of influence, like, on the tip of this finger. And if you look at the black and white version, with the exception maybe of a little bit in the nail, I can't see any of that. Which is usually why I turn on the color ramp, because it's just, again, I think a little bit more descriptive of like what you're actually seeing. If you're going to use this, how you work with it, totally up to you. But basically how you use this is if you scroll down, there's like a stroke, which basically just changes your brush size a little bit. So you can scale that down if you need to. Maybe I'll do something like 1. It's a very, very sensitive slider. I'll do something like 1. And the rest of it kind of works a little bit like Photoshop, honestly. So there's the paint operation. There's two things that I sort of usually use by default. I'll start with replace. This is treated basically like if you are coloring over a layer in Photoshop with a brush. So you have your opacity and you have the value. And value in this case, instead of being an RGB value like it would be in Photoshop, is basically a value of like weight percentage, or like how much influence does this particular joint have. So with this set to 1, you're saying I would like joint 2 to have all of the influence over the particular vertices that I'm painting. Set to 0, it's going to say I'm removing influence from this joint. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Cool. All right, so basically when you're scribbling on this, so I'm going to go ahead and do joint 2. And I'm just going to sort of go ahead and paint in randomly some influence on this. You'll notice it looks pretty circus tenty actually. But if we scrub through our timeline, I've done horrible things to the weights on this, but you can see that it is deforming very differently than the unmodified version here. Excuse me. So one thing I also sort of want to bring to your attention while I'm doing replace, you'll notice that as I was painting this, I get some splotchy areas of white or full influence for joint 2 and some splotchy areas of red. If you ever want to be guaranteed to like paint in values of 1 consistently, you do need to use this brush with no fall off. That will allow you to very systematically go in and just be like, boop, everything is 1 now. You can also do the opposite if you set value to 0 and just be like, nope, no influence at all here. Great. Except on these like weird vertices that I've like really smashed aggressively under the nail there. And again, you'll see how that sort of changes, oh god. You'll see how that sort of changes the way the finger behaves. That is deeply uncomfortable. But yeah, so I mean, that's pretty much the replace brush. Smooth brush, in my mind, acts a little bit like sort of a smudge tool in Photoshop. So what it's gonna do is basically, as you trace over an area, it's just gonna sort of normalize or like average the whatever weight values are in there. So you notice that like the more I go over this, it's taken my values of total influence down pretty significantly, down to something more green or like, I don't know, it's like 33-ish% influence. It will theoretically make this finger bend slightly less catastrophically than it did before. So that's the basics of how to use the Paint Skin Weights tool. Usually what I'll do is go through and look at it and say, okay, so joint 5 is actually this like weird sort of hand joint I had floated out here. If this was connected to a hand, I would probably use it. But in this case, I just want to remove all of the influence from that particular joint on this finger. So I'm going to go in and just, I will set my brush radius to be something much larger and just sort of scribble over my model like that. And the next thing I usually do for something like this is I'll go in to say something like joint 2. So that is the joint right here at the sort of bottom of the finger. And that really shouldn't, I don't think that needs to be affecting like the areas at the top of the finger, so I'm just going to sort of scribble that out. Perhaps something like that. And just sort of go through and continually do that for the rest of the piece. So joint 3 is like the second joint. That doesn't really need to affect like the tip of the finger. And again, just sort of systematically go through and sort of like kill some of these values. So this is probably going to look really weird still when I bend it. It's actually, somehow that still is kind of better than this, except for this. But you can kind of go through and again, just sort of like modify values based on your needs. You can also do this while the model is actually bent, if that is helpful. So one thing I'll do a lot is just sort of come through and like, what am I doing right now? As a model is bent, I'll just sort of color on it. What are you doing? Okay, that was weird. Color on, so you can really refine, like if there's a particular bend that you're not happy with, you can really go in and like refine that to get whatever whatever effect you want sort of manually. And if you mess something like that up, you can kind of go in maybe with the smooth tool and you can see that that's sort of like punching those values so they look a little bit less catastrophically terrifying. But yeah, so that's, I mean, honestly, that's more or less the Paint Skin Weights tool. It is a lot of just sort of going back and forth and like tweaking one area, tweaking another area until you get something that you're happy with. So this will be useful if you guys do have something soft in your model that requires like a hard bend like this, like a finger or an elbow joint. If you need to do something like a cable, it's pretty much more straightforward. Before we do, I have like one more thing I want to show you with the finger that's kind of like a faster way to do this for hard bends, and then I'll just show you like a really simple sort of like mushy cable. Any questions on this before we go on to the other version? All right. So like I said, Paint Skin Weights tool I think is more useful for something like shoulders or even soft cables. If you need something with a hard bend, I prefer a slightly different method of working. And that is, I'm just going to grab some of these vertices, go into Window, General Editors, and Component Editor. And there's a Smooth Skins tab that is, for once, actually open by default. But basically what this display is it's showing you all of the different vertices you have selected, and the precise numerical value of all of the influences on that vertex. So like finally select one, you can see really, really specifically exactly what's happening with the skin weights. So if you ever have anything that's like, it's behaving really, really oddly, you can come in here and kind of see what's happening. But the power of this is that you can actually also modify these values. So in this case, joint 1 is that weird sort of like floating hand joint that I want no influence on. I can select all of the vertices in this model and just sort of come through and manually enter a value of 0. And as soon as I hit enter, you'll notice that that value is input, and this joint 1 is going to disappear as an influence from all of these vertices. So I can do the same thing. I can come back and say, all right, the tip of this finger, I only want to have influence on joint 4. I'm just going to select those verts, type in 1, hit enter, and now they are only controlled by the end of the finger. So with a pretty minimal clicking, we already have something that's like kind of better looking than what we had before, I think. And then the power I think of using this method is for when you need areas like this, where it's like you just want like a really specific bend in a certain area. So I'm just going to select like the sort of center loop of each finger joint, go in and say, I think it's, yeah, so joint 1, I want no influence, and the rest of these I'm just going to manually type in a value of 0.5. And I'll do kind of the same thing. I found that on each side, so like, again, I don't need any influence from joint 2. You can see there's only 0.001% influence, which is kind of pointless. I'm just going to get rid of that. So joint 4, like this side is a little bit closer to the tip of the finger. So I'm going to set that as a value of like 0.8. 0.8. It's going to automatically put 80% of the weight on the joint for the tip of the finger and 20% on the sort of middle joint. And I'll do the opposite thing for the loop on the other side of the finger, where joint 4 gets 20% and joint 3, which is this one, gets 80%. So you'll notice now if I bend this, I do have this very, very nice sort of crease here. If I smooth the model, it holds up really nicely, where it gives you, again, that like nice little sort of like crease. Holds up in high poly and low poly, and the volume of the finger is being held much, much better. It's not being like crushed down like it is over here. So the component editor I think is like super powerful for doing fingers. It's also really nice if you're doing an area like, if you do have fingers and they're actually like smushed next to each other, it's physically hard to access areas between the fingers with the paint skin weights tool. So a lot of times I'll just come into an orthographic mode and set up the fingers in like a quarter of the time, and it's delightful. So that's the two ways to kind of affect the weighting of a model. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. Last thing I want to go over like super fast is if you guys ever, again, are doing something like a cable, I feel like probably fewer people have something like this on their robots. So if you're ever doing something like a cable and you need to rig that, you do need to make sure that there are sufficient number of polys. The same thing like if you're trying to use like a bend deformer or something like that, you do need the poly resolution in here to be able to actually bend this properly. If there's no subdivisions, it's not going to bend right. But basically what I'm going to... It's like killing me with the hotkeys have changed literally since yesterday. But what I'm going to do is just create a little joint chain going up this spine. So ideally what you would want to do in this instance is make sure that these are relatively equally spaced apart and in a straight line. The easiest way to make these a straight line I've found is to just sort of grab all of them at once and just press and hold V and vert snap it to the side of the cylinder and, ooh, hello. And then push the joints back into the center of the cylinder. And then what we do is the same thing we did before. Grab your skin, grab your skeleton, do skin, and bind skin. And we should be able to, yeah, I had a feeling it was going to happen. Not great default behavior. So there's ways to fix this. I'm not super going to go over them because normally you would have controllers on them, which would kind of negate any of these fixes. But one thing you will notice if you're looking at this is it's super squiggly and ridiculous, but it's kind of behaving like a finger in the sense that this joint is far enough away from this joint, and we're getting a little bit, instead of like a smooth squiggly bend, we're getting some kind of hard creases and straight lines between the joints. So if that ever happens, there's sort of two solutions that I've found. One is modify the weights of the joints. Sometimes that will help. And if that doesn't do enough of what you need, you're going to have to go in and manually add more joints into this so that you just have physically more areas to actually bend and control within this little squiggle. I've actually found over the last 2 days or whatever that like if I come in and just sort of hit this with the smooth brush, it's been doing a fairly good job of actually kind of fixing this issue. So you can see again, I'm just sort of coming in with my smooth brush and just kind of scribbling aimlessly over this model. And it is kind of making that a little bit of a smoother transition in there. Again, it doesn't fix everything, but it is significantly nicer than what we started with. So that's kind of like usually how I'll do smooth cables. I mostly just wanted to show you guys, like, you might need to like play with the weights a lot to not make it like funky looking. And if that doesn't work, then again, adding more joints is the sort of surefire way to ensure you have the curvature you like. That is all I had for you on smooth skin binding. Yes?
So, for cables, like I was planning on having wires in it, but I wasn't figuring out. I'll tell you about this later.
Mm-hmm.
But like, would you recommend doing this versus like doing like a dynamic cable with 2 fixed points? Dynamic curve.
Yeah. So it depends on your setup. I am gonna go over really quick how to rig cables for like a manual cable rig. I would say whenever possible, it's always good to use dynamic curves. I did find, because I was playing with that for a while, and for some reason on my Maya seems particularly buggy, but I did find every once in a while that like as soon as I set up a dynamic curve and I tried to like scrub through my timeline, just for like normal animation or whatever, it would like crash Maya aggressively, or it would just cause weird errors where like skins would stop following the skeleton, so it was like really, really hard to animate, and I would have to close Maya and then reopen it. So I would say it is not at all unreasonable or illogical to use a dynamic curve. It may cause strange viewport errors in Maya, and it might be good to play with that and see if that happens, and if it does, maybe figure out a different solution. Because I've not figured out a way to prevent that yet, and it's very, very annoying. Did I answer your question? Kind of?
Kind of. We can talk about it.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, I feel like seeing your model specifically would probably help with that. Cool. Any other questions on smooth skin binding? All right. Hey, and actually, after the first crash where it tried to save the model, it actually didn't crash on me. That's exciting. So if anyone wants to follow along with this, I do have in the sample models folder under Maya files, just this like, I didn't put the, I made this robot rig. So I'm just gonna go ahead and download that and throw that into Maya really quick. So this is the robot that I used for the tutorial videos, and it just has, for some reason I thought it was a great idea to put a crap ton of cables on its back, which is just like all of this nonsense, which I've like zip tied to his leg, and it's a whole thing, and I'm like, why did I do this? So what I want to show you how to set up is, I demoed the arms for the other classes, I'll do the legs for Grins, but basically, you can see I've kind of set it up here, is manual cable controls, so that you can mess with the positioning and stretching of these cables. And you'll notice that it also, like if I bend the torso, ignore that arm cable. Oh wow, that's even more broken than yesterday. Oh wait, no, I just didn't do that one. This one is extremely broken. I'm gonna turn this off because it makes me sad. But you'll notice that the cables on the back follow along with it. I am going to show you an amended video of how to modify your cable, because like this one's like set up a little bit weird, so I'm probably just going to like modify that, and I'll put a video on that. Oh god, this makes me so sad. I set up bad constraints. But again, it'll sort of, you can see like this kind of translates along with the rest of it, and you have the ability if you need to sort of like move things and reshape them. So this is what I'd suggest if you want like ultimate control over your cables. Or if you like can't get dynamic curves working, is to set up some kind of weird little solution like this. I was also playing around on the head where you can see like this one I have manual controls and like a little rig on the center of this. This one I don't have that. I have controls on the top and bottom, so I can kind of like mess with how they connect to the head. But the actual inside portion or like middle portion is being controlled just by not dynamics. You can actually lock a curve's length, but I was finding that that was causing problems with basically binding the skin to that curve. Like the curve behaves beautifully, the mesh not so much. So if I figure out a way to do that, I'll let you guys know. I spent far too long looking at that, but I'm going to show you guys how to set something like this up again for a leg. what I'm going to do is just come through, and I'm going to just really quick. So you can see actually that the what I've set up is geometry cables that are going to render, and each one of those has a little curve inside them. So this is actually the curve that I used to create the cables themselves. I just happened to like save them. So one thing you can do that's kind of cool is, if I can find it, give me 5 seconds. All right. I just want to show you guys how to make these cables really quick, because it is actually kind of handy for like weird stuff, occasionally like barbed wire. No, okay. Huh? Hey, I found a thing. Okay. So basically, what this is if you ever need to, you can extrude geometry along a path the same way you would extrude like a curve. So right here I have this, oh, the lag. I have this goofy little sort of cable thing that I have set up. You can see at one point I just made some of these little discs, flat discs, and I just mesh combined 3 of them together at different sizes. So what you want to do is just sort of grab this little disc, select all the faces in the disc. For some reason, if you do the object, it's not going to work. You must select the faces for this. Don't really know why. And then if you shift select your curve, and you can just do the regular extrude like you would do if you were poly modeling, hit extrude, and it should lag a little bit, and then make this awful, awful shape. The reason that this is not following the curve is there's no geometry on the inside. So if you just kind of go into your little poly extrude face, and you'll notice that like as I add more divisions, it starts to follow the bend of that cable a little bit more closely. I'm going to go ahead and just type in like 50 divisions. I feel like I might regret that, but whatever. And then the other thing you'll notice, so like if you're looking at the robot model, the cables have a little bit of twist to them. So I did that just by going through, if you just grab the object, and you can go into your channel box and find this little extrude face, and just go down. There is an option for twist. So you can twist that however many degrees you want. I'm just going to say 1,000. And the lag, and you'll notice that that's added, really? And that's added some twist to the cable. There's also other options if you guys ever need to mess with them for like taper and other things, but it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for a cable, so I'm just going to kind of leave that. You can also, again, if you want to build on this, you can use the same principle to make a little wrapped wire, and then use mesh to populate barbs for barbed wire if you ever need to make really nice looking barbed wire. Which someone had to do. It's not just like a thing that I was like, we need to make barbed wire. Someone actually needed it for a project. But this is lagging. I'm gonna really quick actually close Maya and reopen it because this is being like unbearably slow. Fixed it yesterday. Hopefully it does today. Hopefully it fixes it. This computer is highly questionable. All right, anywho. So while that was lagging very aggressively, after this demo, we're gonna take a quick break. And then what I've been doing for the other classes is pretty much, I'll give you guys like about a half an hour of open lab where you guys like have to stay and work on stuff. And then I'll pretty much let you guys out a half an hour early, or you can hang out for the other half an hour and continue doing open lab. All right, so we have a thing. Hooray. I've never seen Maya lag this badly on these computers, but anywho. All right, so I'm just gonna hide some of this stuff and I'm actually just gonna delete like this part of the leg, why not? So I'll hide the geometry of the skin. I'll come through and I will hide the geometry of the leg. So right now we are only looking at actually you will notice really quick if you're looking at this curve. So there's a few places on this where the curve should sort of stay at a fixed point or stay stationary. So wherever it's connected into like little ports, like it is on the hips and the foot, and then anywhere that it's been zip tied to my robot, these are areas that I don't want to move. So what I'm going to do is just sort of use a series of joints to sort of block out. I usually start with the areas where it doesn't need to move and it needs to stay fixed. Zip ties. So what I'm going to do is just pick an orthographic camera, find one that's sort of logical. Cool. All right. I'm going to turn off my grid because that's really darn hard to look at. And I'm just going to select my curve. Excuse me. And you'll notice that there's like one cool thing you can do to actually display, like if you're looking at the control vertices, if you want those to be present all the time and be available to snap objects to, you can just sort of grab your curve, go up to display, NURBS, and CVs. And what this is going to do is just going to make those little CVs permanently visible and allow you to, it doesn't allow you to actually really click them. If you click it, it'll select the whole curve, but you can snap stuff to this. In this case, I'm going to use joints. So this whole thing is just set up with a bunch of different joints. So just go up to skeleton and create joints. And if you press and hold V, you can vert snap directly to those little CVs. So it ensures that you get your joints pretty much right where you want them, which is really, really nice. Really quick, I'm going to make the joint radius larger just so you guys can see it. 3, hooray. So I usually start at the, again, all the points where this curve needs to stay stationary. So I'll start at the end, make a little curve, or sorry, make a joint, and then press and hold V, and just vert snap it to those CVs and hit OK. And this is all we need. So basically this little joint is just going to sit here and hold the end of this curve in place so it doesn't move around whenever we're playing with the center of the curve. So we need the same thing pretty much set up for the zip ties. So I'm just going to make another joint, holding down V, and that's going to hold, it's going to hold this side for the zip tie, but we need a way to also hold this end here. So I'm just going to add another joint right on this little CV. Can you guys all see this curve? Like, is that easy enough for you guys to see on the projector? Yeah. Okay. I always ask, if you guys ever can't see stuff, let me know, because I always look and I'm like, I can't see any of that without my glasses on. So I can always change the curve color and, like, you know, make sure you guys can see what's going on. But I'm just going to grab this little skeleton and parent it under this one. So if we grab this joint we laid, you'll notice that it's sort of pinning both of these other joints in place. If we move them, they're sort of connected. In the sort of revised tutorial, I'm probably going to show you a more robust way to do that, so you get individual control over both sides of the cable, if you need it. And then again, pretty much just repeat the exact same thing up here. Rigging is a very, very redundant process, especially for things like this. So now that we have this set up, we need a way to, again, this is like pretty much anything that's going to hold the curve in place. We need a way to control the inside, or like the little sort of bends in this curve, the loose areas. And that is just going to be a bunch of other joints. So I'm just going to go through, again, snap a joint to this curve, and then pretty much I'll just do a bunch of like little individual joints on every little CV down this curve. Again, it's fairly redundant. This one down here, I'm actually going to do something a little bit different because I have these 3 cables. This is going to be a setup like I did in the back if any of you guys happen to be looking at the file. It's also, I'm going to set this up like the same way I would as like a root joint in a spine, where you have like the root, a spine, and a pelvis all in the same spot. So I'm going to make this joint here, and then I'm going to duplicate it 3 times. And I'm going to then make another joint on this CV, and another joint on this CV. So what we have is 2 floating joints, and then 3 joints in the same spot there. I'm then going to sort of grab these, and again, I'll probably make like another video on this, because I'm not entirely happy with the way that the original rig came out. So we have individual control of this side, individual control of this side. You're just going to grab these and parent them under this middle joint. So we can move all of these at once and then still have control over a particular side if we want to, you know, mess with the curve a little bit in a more refined way. So this is how I like having stuff set up. I'll show you this way on the bottom and then like the janky way on the top. This is pretty much what we have for the skeleton. I would highly recommend going through and labeling things properly. In this case, I am not going to make you sit through that, so we're just going to kind of pretend like I labeled everything not terribly. Next thing that I usually do is attach the curve to these joints, which you can actually do with smooth skin binding, just like we did for the finger. Not gonna lie, didn't know that was a thing you could do with curves until like a day ago. But basically I'm just gonna select all the joints because they're different joint chains. So I selected all of the joints that I want to attach, and the curve, go to skin and bind skin. In this case, you could select joint hierarchy. I'm just gonna do selected joint since I know I've selected the exact joints I want. And I'm gonna do something a little bit different with the max influences. I'm gonna actually set this to 1. By doing that, because I have a single joint on each and every control vertex or like editable point in this curve, it's pretty much going to weight that curve or like that little control vertex only to the joint directly on top of it, which makes things just kind of like convenient. So I'll go ahead and hit apply, and you'll notice now that if I grab this joint, it's going to move the curve around with it. It's also not going to take, like this control vertex is staying exactly where it is until I go ahead and like move this joint. So that's the basic sort of premise of how to set this up. You will also need controllers to actually, you know, affect this because again, if you're doing your rig, you should never have to go in and like select any of these joints or this curve for really anything. So I'm just gonna go ahead and just make a bunch of really sort of boring default curves for this. I'll set this to 90 degrees. And I'm just gonna scale that up so you can kind of actually see it. And I'm pretty much just going to dump a curve on every point in this joint chain that I've made. One interesting thing that you can do, that I usually sort of like doing earlier rather than later, is actually change the color of your curve. It affects nothing, it's purely a user ease of use kind of thing. So my sort of weird notation for this is anything that should be pinned down or attached, I'm gonna make that curve red. So to do that, select your curve, go into your attribute editor. You want to make sure you're on the shape node for that curve. And if you go under Object Display, Drawing Overrides, you will find this little Enable Overrides checkbox. Check it, and it should open up a bunch of other options. If for some reason you want to, you can turn off Visible. You can also actually turn off Playback, which if you go ahead and like, no, sorry, that was a different option. Somewhere in here. Here it is. It's actually hide on playback. So if you want, set all of your curves to automatically turn off whenever you go through your time slider, or like if you're play blasting or something like that, which could be really helpful. Unfortunately, you have to manually set this up for every curve or script it, but it might save you some time. I don't know. It just depends if you'll remember to do stuff. Yeah. That is true. You can copy this curve, and it should. Hello. You can duplicate objects, and it'll like keep the same features. But if you don't do that and don't think of that, then you would have to set it up manually. But yes, you can totally copy the curves. Which is actually why I'm going to set this up with this enabled override before I start doing things. Otherwise, I would have to do it repeatedly. So once you check this box, you should be able to pretty much scroll through this little color picker thing down here. And I'll stop at red, and you'll notice that now my curve is red. Again, purely an ease of use thing. I just think it makes things easier to look at. So I'm just going to duplicate this little red curve and throw that on anywhere that I need to be pinned. This little blue guy, I'm just going to sort of use as my controller for everything else, basically. Chuck him down here. Boop. And yeah. All right, so this is like the basic curve setup. One thing, and I'm actually remembering to do it for once, and this is highly, highly, highly important. I mentioned it in my videos. I think I forget to do it in my videos, and then redo it. Highly important. Before you hook up your controls to your skeleton, always zero out the values of them. the reason that you want to do that, and I forget every time, the reason that you want to do this is if you are, moving this around and you're like, oh, I need to, put this back where it was originally. If you don't zero out these values, you have to remember somehow what that was. If you zero them out, you can just be like, oop, I need to go back to bind pose. Everything's set to 0, and then you're good to go. So it's really, really important that you do that early. If you find that if you start like attaching your controllers to your joints and you haven't zeroed out your translations, you should detach your controllers, zero your joints, and reset up the parent constraints. Yes, it will take you an extra 3 minutes. It will save you several hours when you're animating. I cannot stress how important that is. Anywho, so once you've zeroed out all your controllers, you can go in and start constraining them to your skeleton. So grab the controller, grab the joint to constrain, and I'm going to do a parent constraint. Just basic default settings for that. And I should be able then to move this around and rotate this, modify the curve. Pretty much just go through and do this down the entire line of curves. It's delightfully tedious. Yes. Oops. All right. So we have some awkward little joints now. They should all be, attached to some stuff. I'm going to leave this one down here, like kind of simple for now. And now we need a way, so we have a curve that follows joints and joints that follow controllers. But if we grab the body, you'll notice like if we move this around, the controllers aren't going to follow the body. We're just going to have like a weird skeleton just sort of like floating in space, which is obviously not what we want. So there's a few different ways. Usually just sort of, I use constraints to do all this, how I will attach these curves into the body itself. So when you watch the videos, I will show you a way to do this to ensure that like the finger controls, like if I move this hand, the fingers always stay with it. They'll rotate with it, all that good stuff. It's the exact same principle as that. So what I'm going to do is just grab this little curve here. I'm going to just sort of throw it in a null group and make sure to center the pivot on that group. And I'm going to actually select, I want this to follow along with the sort of ankle here, so I'm going to grab the ankle joint and then grab that little group I just made with the controller in it and do another parent constraint. So I'm constraining basically this group with the controller to follow along with the foot. So if I move the foot, it should take this controller with it. So this is what's going to anchor the cable itself in place on the foot. And you'll notice that because I constrained a group instead of the controller itself, I am still able to modify this controller and do little tweaks to the cable if I need to. So the same premise is basically going to go through for the rest of these. I'm going to make a little group and center the pivot. I'll just sort of do this for the rest of the pinned groups for now. And I'll just go through my joint chain and attach these in. So in this case, the zip tie should be sort of following along with this joint. So grab that, grab the group, constrain, parent, and just systematically do this until you are done. I did promise you that this was a convoluted way of doing things, but it does work and it is fairly robust. If you set it up and it doesn't explode. So what we have now, we should have pretty much half of our controllers sort of following along with our skeleton. You can see that anywhere, these little red groups, it is following along. We just need to make these guys also follow along. Anyone want to take a stab at how we would do that? Okay, more parent constraints is the answer that I was going for. And basically we're going to do something a little bit different. So all these pin joints, they're following only one joint. These, it would be nice if they sort of followed between two. So you'll notice here, watch this little chunk of controllers. If I move this, it follows along, but not entirely. And if I go ahead and I move, let's see if I actually constrain the pelvis. I did. If I move the pelvis, it also moves with that. So basically, still going to use a parent constraint, just going to constrain it to 2 joints instead of a single one. And to do that, we need to, once again, go through, group this, modify, center pivot, group, group. And I'm just using hotkeys to do this. I'm just selecting a controller and doing Control G to group it, G to repeat last command, which was center pivot, and that should give us that. Hotkeys, they make everything faster. All right. So what I'm going to do now is basically like this. I would like to follow between sort of the hip joint and this lower leg joint. So I'm going to grab I'll grab the lower leg. It doesn't really matter which order you do this. Grab the lower leg, grab the hip, and then grab, oh God. This, guys, is why you should label stuff. Like, in all seriousness, this is terrible. I've gone through and systematically, I knew I did 4 joints, so I've been like counting so I knew which group to select, but you should totally label stuff. So grab all these things and then do a constrain parent again. And hopefully, if we say like move this pelvis joint, you can see that this little controller is sort of following along somewhere between the pelvis and the other joint here. If we actually go in and click on the parent constraint, you'll notice that there are 2 weights, again, one for the hip and one for the pelvis, because we've selected multiple controllers for this joint. If you need to, if it's not quite following the way you expect, you can actually modify these. So just go in and like enter a value of, say maybe 2 for the pelvis. We'll cause it to follow the pelvis more than it did previously. You can also go through and, if you need to, you can set up some fancy attributes to control this remotely. But you can go in and, again, like sort of manually change how this is behaving to affect the curvature of your object. You can also go in and just manually shift this around if you need to. And again, because we've zeroed the controllers, we can very easily just be like, nope, that was dumb. So that's the basic premise of sort of setting this up. And it pretty much does exactly the same thing for the rest of these joints. So just grab the 2 joints you want it to sort of interpolate between, grab the group with the controller in it, parent constraint, and do that all the way down the leg. It's delightful and soul-sucking, and it really makes me question why I put so many cables on this character. But it does work. So again, like if we grab this leg, that's a joint. If we grab this leg, you see we actually have something like fairly decent looking for how this is moving. Any questions on any of this so far? All right. Last thing we need is the cable actually attached to the curve. So I am just going to go in really quick and hide. Oh my God, there's so many joints. I'm just going to hide all of these joints and actually group them together and just hide these joints. Too much to look at. So what I want to do now is, again, find wherever the heck I put this cable. Hooray. I need this cable to follow the curve. So I happen to delete history on this cable so that if I modify this curve, it's not going to, that was weird. It's not going to actually change the cable with it. So if you haven't deleted history, your cable might actually just be following the curve already, and that's awesome, and that's a totally viable way to do this. If that's not an option for you at this point for whatever reason, you can use a wire deformer to attach this to your curve. It's not technically smooth skin binding. I would actually go ahead and just say the smooth skin binding would qualify as that curve that you've bound to the little joints that you've made if you were concerned about like meeting the minimum requirement for having smooth skin binding. But this is going to use a wire deformer. So if you go up to constrain, I'm sorry, not constrain. If you go up to deform and wire, usually I just go through, make sure this is all set to the default. Should work pretty well for this. It actually tells you in the very bottom left how to set this up. I assume that it's very small and in a bad position on the screen and you're not going to be able to see it. But it basically says select shapes to deform and press enter. So in this case, select the cable that you want to deform and press enter. Do as the computer bids you. And then it's saying select, every time I mouse over it gets rid of it, select wire curves and press enter to finalize operation. So I'm going to go into my wireframe, select the wire, and hit enter. And it should be good. Like at this point, if I move my pelvis, we should have, theoretically, a cable that follows along, which it's sort of doing. Kind of. Maybe. There's an easy fix for this. This is actually basically what the computer, like, this is totally normal. To fix this, select the geometry that you've just applied the wire deformer to, go into this little wire input here in your channel box and set the drop-off distance higher. It should then, if you set it to 0, it doesn't follow your curve at all, but it should then follow your curve properly. If you're using this method with a wire deformer and you're ever moving your character around the scene and it starts doing that weird sort of like circus tent effect or whatever, like it's doing here, you probably just need to set this higher. As your character moves around the scene, it might not pick up, like you might go out of the range of this drop-off distance. So you can just set it to like 1,000,000 or something insane, and that should be a pretty safe value to encompass your scene. And that is actually pretty much set up. That is basically, you know, a nice little goofy functional wire thing. I've not constrained that one, which is why that's behaving awfully. And then like this will be an area where like, okay, this is clearly not what we want, so I could then go in and sort of like poke that out and maybe sort of rotate these a little bit so that they're behaving in a way that's more expectable. But yeah, that's pretty much my weird bit on rigging leg cables. Again, a little bit convoluted. I don't know if any of you guys are actually going to use this, but it is sort of a good example of like all of these joints that we put in are not connected into the main skeleton. Everything is attached together basically with like controls and constraints, and that's a totally viable way to rig stuff. Yeah, that was pretty much it. Anyone have any questions on that? Spin-off things they want to say? All right, cool. Anybody have any questions on anything else? All right, in that case, 5-minute break. When you come back, it's stay for half an hour and then do some work, and then I'll let you go early if you want, or you can just hang out for Open Lab for more time. Yes, give me